Today I'm going to share with you 5 uncomfortable retirement truths that typically take people a couple months into retirement and sometimes as long as a couple years. And I want you to benefit from other people's experience as opposed to having to learn from your own mistakes, which can be painful and costly. So how do I know this stuff? Because I've been a financial advisor for over 20 years and I've helped guide hundreds of families into retirement. So let's jump in. You're going to like the first uncomfortable truth. The jury's out on what you're going to think of the other 4. But the one you're going to like is, after doing this for 20 years, I firmly believe that most people should be spending more money in retirement, not less. Here's why I say that. When you come up with a retirement plan, you're stress testing it, you're measuring it, you're analyzing it, you're looking at tons of data, and you walk away with this sense of certainty. But the reality is there is no certainty with a retirement plan, right? We're trying to forecast the future. We don't know what inflation is going to be in the future. We don't know what our own health is going to be in the future. There's all these big factors. Taxes tend to be one of a retiree's biggest expense. Heck, we don't know what taxes are going to be 8 months from now at the start of the new calendar year, let alone in 5, 10, 15, or 20 years. So I think that sense of certainty is a false warm blanket that makes you feel good, but it also likely is causing you to spend less money than what you could. And why do I say that? Because the foundation of retirement planning is a tool called Monte Carlo simulation, right? On average, the stock market delivers 7, 8, 9% return depending on what time period you want to look at. But you don't want to say, well, I'm getting 8% in the stock market. Why don't I just spend 8% and I'll be fine? Well, unfortunately, that's not the way the numbers work. And so we use a Monte Carlo simulation in order to get away from averages and try to get a sense of what's the likelihood of success with a plan, given that the stock market doesn't work like that. You can't just spend what the average return is. And the reason is because when the stock market has negative years, those impact you more than what the positive years are. It's called sequence of return risk. It's a topic for another conversation. But the way we use this Monte Carlo simulation was the tool was used in engineering for decades. And then there was a rocket scientist, literally MIT trained rocket scientist, turned financial advisor of all things, later in his life after he sold the business that he and his family ran, a gentleman by the name of William Bengen. He came up with the 4% rule, but he designed the Monte Carlo simulations that is the base of so much of what financial advisors do, based on a 3% failure rate. Now, a 3% failure rate is how you design maybe the floodwater capabilities of a town, right? You plan for the 90-year storm, so 90% of the time it never happens. But I would argue that's not how you plan for retirement planning. It's way, in my opinion, it's way too conservative. This is not financial advice for you, but I want to put this on your radar screen so you're thinking about this. So the 4% rule would say if you had a $500,000 portfolio, you could spend 4% of that a year, or $20,000. In each year, you could increase that by the rate of inflation. So the purchasing power would feel the same. But a 3% failure rate, that's not how we as humans live. And it's based on all of these unknowns that we put into the plan, and then the financial advisor puts out a plan and says, okay, this is the answer. Well, it's not the answer. It's a place to start. But if instead of using 4%, what if you spent 5%? That's 25% more. What if you spent 6%? That's 50% more cash flows from the plan. Now, is that going to work for you? I don't know. You have to work with a financial advisor and figure it out, and also based on what level of comfort do you need. But by definition, the financial advising industry is planning for just 3% of the people that fail. And most of us, many of us, might be comfortable with a 20% probability that we have to tweak things, right? We don't get to where we're 88 and we run out of money and we have to make drastic changes. We make changes early on. The biggest risk to a financial plan is in your first 5, 7, 10 years. Sequence of return risk again. Well, most of us are going to get through that just fine. So why burden ourselves with this overly conservative strategy? I think you can spend more money. I want you to work with a financial advisor and share with them, hey, I'm not sure I need a 3% failure rate. Maybe I'm okay with a 10% failure rate. Let's plan things for a 90% likelihood of success or an 80% likelihood of success. And 80% is not for everybody. It is for me, full disclosure. That's what my retirement plan is going to be based on. But you do you, and you work with your financial advisor. Okay, let's keep going. Uncomfortable truth number 2 is not having a paycheck is going to be way harder than what you think it's going to be. It's a huge psychological change, particularly if you retire in your 50s, which it's a big part of my channel is encouraging people to retire in their 50s. You're not going to have Social Security coming in. So in some ways, Social Security can feel like a paycheck, right? Coming in, and for most of us, it's going to be a much smaller paycheck, but at least we have income coming in. But it's a huge psychological barrier when for 20, 30, 40 years, you've had a paycheck coming in. So just be prepared. At the end of the video, I'm going to talk about some things that you can do to prepare for these things. But that's uncomfortable truth number 2. Uncomfortable truth number 3 is super important. And that is the way you feel about risk once you retire is going to change dramatically. Just because in the past, maybe when the stock market crashed, you never sold out, right? Which is one of the main ways that people get hurt in the stock market. Stock market goes down. If you don't sell, and historically it always has, when the market comes back, you're fine. If you had invested just before the great financial crisis, and let's say in 2006, 2007, yes, there was a 60% drop in the stock, almost 60%, 57% for the S&P 500, top to bottom. But if you had stayed the course and didn't sell, looking at where are we at now, 15, 17 years since the great financial crisis, you would have been fine. You wouldn't have been hurt. But where people get hurt is when they become what I call a forced seller in a down market. And why do people become forced sellers? Oftentimes it's not because they have to sell, right? Maybe they have to sell some stocks because they're retired, and they have to sell some stocks in order to pay their living expenses. Although if you're working with a financial advisor, they should have you in high quality, stable bonds that hopefully didn't move much at all in price during scary times. And instead of thinking I've got 40% of my portfolio in bonds or 30% in bonds, your financial advisor should be coaching you to think about, I've got 5 years worth of living expenses in bonds. I've got 7 years in living expenses in bonds. So when something like the great financial crisis happens, 2008, 2009, you don't have to sell stocks. You're not a forced seller. But if the anguish, if the anxiety, if the mental pain of seeing the stock market drop that much, if that pain was so high that you just couldn't take it anymore, you couldn't sleep, you went weeks without sleeping, you were super bothered. Let's say you had $1 million portfolio and half of it was in stocks, so you have $500,000. A 60, let's just give me easy math, a 50% drop in the stock market, that's $250,000. For most of us, saving that kind of money takes a decade or longer. So you're looking at your portfolio and saying, in a year, I've lost what took me over a decade to build up, maybe 15 years, maybe 20 years. $250,000 is real money, and it causes anguish. And there's a reason why in the English language, we have a different word for anguish, right? It's a level of acuteness that's 10 times the level of acuteness of worrying. It's not just that you're worried about your portfolio. It's causing you anguish. you've got a knot in your stomach. You can't let go of it. And if that happens to you, you could be in a situation where, because of the mental pain, you're making yourself a forced seller. So getting that asset allocation right, being able to weather the difficult periods in retirement is super important. It's going to determine, I think, 80+% of your success on the investing side for your retirement plan. Definitely. Here, let me take this mic off. This is super important. Definitely work with a financial advisor. You don't have to work with me. I'm not saying that. I'm saying work with a financial advisor to figure out your asset allocation, because you don't know what you don't know when it comes to your emotions. And somebody like a financial advisor that's been doing this for 10, 20 years, that's helped work with hundreds of people transition into retirement, they know a lot of the things that we ourselves don't know, right? I mentioned earlier, Bill Bengens was a, what's his degree, and was basically a rocket scientist, right? Undergrad in aeronautics and astronautics. I would not build a spacecraft on my own. I don't have the skill set to do that. And most people don't have the skill set to get their asset allocation right. And you don't want to be overly conservative because you're leaving a lot of money on the table, but you certainly don't want to stretch and put yourself in a situation where it's going to be too painful when the market goes down. So you don't necessarily have to work with somebody for 20 years, but paying them to get that asset allocation right is super important. And why? Because the pain, how downturns feel for you today is going to be very different once you've retired. Enough said. Okay, number 5. Most people are going to sacrifice unnecessarily in retirement, even if you get those numbers right. Remember earlier we were talking about the 4% rule. Is that the right number? Should it be 5%? Should it be 6% for you, right? You have to work with a financial advisor to figure that out for you. But even if you get the number right, let's say, you decide 4% is the right number for you. Many people still save money. So let's say you've got $1 million from your portfolio. So you've got $40,000 coming in from your investments, plus Social Security, plus any other rental income. It would not be unusual. You would not be alone if you were a retired person and you were saving part of that $40,000 a year, right? It's just what we've done for 20, 30, 40 years. So, but because of that, we're sacrificing unnecessarily. We save that money for a reason, and now is the time to enjoy it. And don't, if you come up with the 4% rule, you do you and work with a financial advisor. Again, none of this is financial advice, but let me take the mic off again. You don't need to save that extra money with your retirement plan. Once you say, okay, we can spend this money, that is spending. It doesn't mean, oh, by the way, save 10, 15, 20% of it. But a lot of people do that. I don't want to see that happen to you. So put it on your radar screen now. Know that it's just human nature for folks that have been saving as long as we have to say, well, of course I'm going to save 10% of this. Okay, be prepared for that so it doesn't surprise you, and you don't unnecessarily sacrifice, particularly in the first year, the second year of retirement, where you're super excited for the adventure to begin. Those are your best go-go years, is when you're excited about it. It feels like a vacation, which leads me into the bonus. So those were your 5 uncomfortable truths. But here's the bonus, and that is, I just mentioned how, maybe the first year, maybe if you're lucky, the first 2 years feels like vacation for you. But eventually, retirement no longer feels like vacation. And so it turns out there's 4 phases to transitioning into retirement. And some of this you can take care of before you retire. So you can be thinking about this now if you're not retired. And the first phase is, it feels like vacation. This is great. Azul was right. I'm so glad I retired early. But hold on, you're gonna be cursing me here pretty soon. Because the second phase is this phase of loss. You're going to start grieving what you've lost. If you've worked in the same industry for 15, 20, 30 plus years, You had influence in that industry. You had a network. You had friends in that industry. And those people are still there, but you've lost many of those common points of commonality. You've lost a common mission. You've lost a common vernacular. You've lost common activities that you're doing every day, particularly with people from the company that you're working with, right? You have a common mission. You're pulling in the same direction. And even with the best of intentions, you're gonna lose some of your work friends. You might lose most of your work friends. I hope that doesn't happen, but it happens a lot, so just be aware of that. So you're gonna feel the loss of that. You're gonna feel the loss of your purpose. Again, if you're working for a company, the company gave you a purpose. You had a job to do that, you commuted to half an hour each way back and forth to work. You were there for 8 hours. Hopefully your boss gave you a lot of accolades for doing your job well. I think that's one of the primary roles of a boss is to motivate his or her team and to make sure that they're clear on the vision. But you're losing all of that and you're going to feel this sense of loss. And so that's the second phase. And then after that, you start entering the third phase, which is iterating and trying out different things, finding your next purpose. And both the loss phase and this iterating phase can be painful. Be perfectly candid about it. Some people are lucky, and the first thing they try for finding their new purpose, the first thing they try resonates with them. But there's a great book to help you think about this, whether you're retired now or you're already in retirement. If you're struggling with this book can help both people in both camps, let's say that. And that book is From Strength to Strength by Arthur Brooks. I've given out probably 100 copies of that book, and I've read it 2 or 3 times myself. It's just really good about talking about these different chapters we go through in life and how we reinvent our purpose. And one of those chapters in our life is retirement. And just know that nobody gets through retirement without going through these phases, so you're not alone. Some people are fortunate. They've been able to do some deep thinking, or it's just the way they've lived their life. They know what their purpose is outside of work. They know what they're going to do when they retire. But if you don't, just a heads up, phases 2, the feeling of loss, phase 3, the reiterating, rediscovering yourself, those can be painful, Those can be painful transitions. And then the fourth phase of that is when you've transitioned. You've got your new identity, and now you're looking back, you've done the hard work, and you say, boy, am I glad. I would never go back to work, right? I like my new identity. I love where I'm at, and I don't want to go back. And oftentimes, people cruise through what I call the youth of their senior years, which I think is really starting at 50. There you're just a pup. You're just a young person. A young youth of your senior years. You're at the very beginning days of that in your early 50s. And then as you approach 65, you're in kind of the core of your senior years. And then as you get older than that, eventually you lose the ability, unfortunately, to go do some of these things that your mind would love to do them, but it's just too difficult. It's too challenging. And I like to remind people, this is another important point. As long as I'm doing this in this video, super important. Unfortunately, when we're 60 years old, we likely have less than 1,000 weeks of healthy, active time in front of us. And that's not a lot of time. And so we want to use that time wisely. And there will come a time where we lose our health, we lose our vitality for the last time. And we're not going to get it back, and we know it. Maybe we're in our 80s. We've had a great run. Our bodies, our vehicles for our lives and retirement served us well. But now the machine's getting old, the vehicle's getting old, and we can't do these things. And I want to encourage you while you still can to take full advantage of the youth of your senior years. And that's why I made this video here, which is 5 reasons as a financial advisor for over 20 years. 5 reasons why I think you should consider, I'm not saying you should do it, but you should consider retiring as soon as you can. Thanks for watching this one. I hope I see you in the next video. Bye-bye.